The Wehrmacht soldiers, crouched inside their reinforced concrete bunkers, believed they were untouchable. Steel doors sealed shut, gun slits offering narrow fields of fire, walls thick enough to withstand artillery barrages. They had survived countless Allied assaults, watching wave after wave of infantry break against their fortifications like water against stone. But on that cold morning in late 1944, something different approached through the smoke and debris. The rumble of tank treads grew louder, and then they saw it. A Sherman tank, but modified in ways that defied their understanding of armored warfare. When the turret swiveled toward their position, what emerged wasn't a shell. It was a torrent of liquid fire that poured through every opening, transforming their impregnable fortress into a crematorium within seconds. The Americans had brought hell itself to the battlefield, and the German doctrine of static defense was about to burn. By the autumn of 1944, the German military had perfected the art of defensive warfare to a degree that bordered on obsession. From the Atlantic Wall stretching across France to the Gothic Line in Italy, from the Siegfried Line protecting the fatherland to countless fortified positions across the European theatre, the Wehrmacht had transformed the landscape into a labyrinth of concrete, steel, and death. These weren't mere trenches or foxholes. They were engineering marvels, bunkers with walls sometimes exceeding 2 meters in thickness, reinforced with steel rebar, designed to withstand direct hits from heavy artillery. The philosophy was simple and, until recently, devastatingly effective. Let the enemy exhaust themselves against immovable objects. German military doctrine, refined through years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front and refined further in the West, emphasized the economy of force. A handful of well-positioned machine gunners in a properly constructed bunker could hold off an entire company of infantry. The mathematics were undeniable. One defender behind concrete was worth 10 attackers in the open. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt himself had proclaimed in a strategic assessment dated September 1944, "Our fortified positions represent not merely defensive installations, but force multipliers of unprecedented magnitude. The enemy bleeds for every meter, and we conserve our strength for the decisive counteroffensive." The assessment wasn't mere propaganda. Allied casualty reports from operations against fortified German positions told a grim story. Attack-to-defender casualty ratios sometimes reached 10-1 or worse when assaulting prepared bunker complexes. The bunkers themselves were marvels of military engineering. Constructed with poured concrete, reinforced with steel mesh, they featured multiple compartments, ventilation systems that could be sealed against gas attacks, interlocking fields of fire, and escape tunnels. The standard MG-42 machine gun, capable of firing 200 rounds per minute, turned each bunker aperture into a zone of absolute lethality. American infantrymen had coined a bitter nickname for these positions: pillboxes of death. The bloody arithmetic of conventional assault Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison of the 2nd Infantry Division had seen the futility firsthand during the assault on the Siegfried Line in October 1944. His after-action report, filed on October 18th, painted a picture of tactical desperation. "We expended 847 rounds of 105mm artillery, 312 rounds of 150mm, and committed 3 full companies to the assault on a single bunker complex designated Hill 232. After 6 hours of continuous combat, we achieved penetration only after a combat engineer team managed to place satchel charges directly against the rear entrance, at the cost of 11 men killed and 23 wounded. The bunker garrison consisted of 9 German soldiers. This arithmetic is unsustainable. The problem wasn't lack of firepower or courage. The Allies possessed both in abundance. The issue was fundamental physics and geometry. Artillery shells, even heavy ones, tended to detonate on impact with the thick concrete, creating craters and surface damage, but rarely achieving penetration. The bunkers were designed with this in mind. their walls angled to deflect blast force, their interiors compartmentalized so that even if one section was breached, the others remained operational. Tank fire proved equally frustrating. The standard 75mm gun on early Sherman tanks could damage bunker exteriors, but lacked the penetrating power to breach the walls. The 70mm gun, introduced later, showed improvement, but bunkers were typically positioned in defilade, protected by terrain features, making direct fire difficult. Moreover, German defenders had become adept at anti-tank tactics, using Panzerfaust rockets and concealed anti-tank guns to destroy any armor that approached too closely. Infantry assaults without adequate support were suicidal. The open ground surrounding most bunker complexes, deliberately cleared by German engineers, became killing zones. Machine gun fire from multiple interlocking positions meant that advancing soldiers faced fire from multiple angles simultaneously. Smoke screens helped, but couldn't eliminate the fundamental problem. At some point, men had to cross open ground and get close enough to the bunker to neutralize it. The most effective conventional method involved combat engineers crawling forward under covering fire to place explosive charges directly against bunker walls or entrances. This technique, while occasionally successful, was agonizingly slow and horrifically costly in lives. Engineers carrying heavy satchel charges or Bangalore torpedoes were particularly vulnerable, and German defenders had learned to focus fire on anyone carrying obvious demolition equipment. The crucible of innovation. It was against this backdrop of tactical frustration that a small group of American military innovators began exploring unconventional solutions. The genesis of what would become the M4A3R3 Zippo flamethrower tank can be traced to multiple parallel developments, but the critical impetus came from the Pacific Theater. In the brutal island-hopping campaigns against Japan, Marine Corps units had encountered similar problems with Japanese bunkers and cave complexes. The Japanese had proven even more fanatical in their defensive tenacity than the Germans, often fighting literally to the last man from fortified positions. Standard tactics were producing casualty rates that threatened to make the advance toward Japan itself prohibitively expensive. Marine Corps Captain Richard Feeberling, an engineering officer who had survived the hell of Tarawa and Saipan, submitted a detailed proposal in July 1944 to the Marine Corps Equipment Board. His memorandum was blunt. "We are using 19th century tactics against 20th century fortifications. The flamethrower has proven effective in the hands of individual Marines, but the operator's vulnerability and limited fuel capacity restrict its utility. What we require is a mobile, armored flamethrower platform capable of approaching fortified positions under fire and delivering sustained flame attacks sufficient to neutralize bunker complexes." The concept wasn't entirely new. Both the British and Germans had experimented with flamethrower tanks earlier in the war. The British Churchill Crocodile, introduced in 1943, had shown promise in European operations. However, the Crocodile's design, with its flamethrower fuel carried in a towed armored trailer, presented logistical complications and vulnerability issues. The Americans needed something more integrated, more mobile, and available in larger numbers. The solution emerged from the marriage of America's most abundant armored platform, the M4 Sherman tank, with the proven E4-5 flamethrower mechanism. The Sherman was far from perfect as a tank destroyer. Its armor and main gun were inferior to German Panthers and Tigers, but it was reliable, mechanically sound, available in vast quantities, and its chassis could accommodate modifications. The devil in the details. The technical challenges were substantial. The primary weapon would be the E45 flamethrower, mounted in place of the bow machine gun. This wasn't a simple substitution. The flamethrower system required fuel tanks, pressurization equipment, ignition systems, and fire control mechanisms, all of which had to be integrated into the Sherman's already cramped interior without compromising the tank's mobility or the crew's ability to operate. Major Robert Dunlop, the Army engineer assigned to oversee the conversion program at the Rock Island Arsenal, recalled the early difficulties in a post-war interview. "We were essentially trying to fit a dragon into a tin can. The fuel mixture, a combination of gasoline and napalm thickening agent, was highly volatile. One penetrating hit to the fuel tanks would turn the entire vehicle into a fireball. We had to balance protection, capacity and functionality while keeping the weight within acceptable limits for the Sherman's suspension and engine. The fuel capacity became a critical design parameter. Too little fuel, and the tank would exhaust its primary weapon too quickly to be tactically useful. Too much fuel, and the weight would compromise mobility and increase vulnerability. The final design settled on approximately 290 gallons of fuel mixture, sufficient for roughly 60 one-second bursts with an effective range of 60 to 80 yards, far superior to the 20-30-yard range of man-portable flamethrowers. The ignition system proved particularly troublesome. Early prototypes suffered from unreliable ignition, with the fuel stream sometimes failing to ignite or igniting prematurely within the barrel, a terrifying malfunction. Engineers eventually developed a reliable electric ignition system using a spark plug mechanism, similar to those in aircraft engines, but ruggedized for the harsh conditions of armored combat. Crew training presented another challenge. Operating a flamethrower tank required different skills and psychology than conventional tank warfare. The operator had to get close to enemy positions, often within 50 yards, and maintain steady aim while under fire. The psychological burden of wielding such a weapon was also significant. As one early trainee put it, "You're not just killing the enemy, you're burning them alive. That's a different thing entirely, and not every man can handle it." The skeptics and the believers. The program faced significant institutional resistance. Conservative elements within the Army's Armored Force Command questioned the entire concept. Brigadier General Alvin Gillum, in a memorandum dated August 1944, expressed the prevailing skepticism. The proposed flamethrower tank represents a specialized weapon of limited utility. Its short range necessitates exposure to enemy anti-tank fire at distances where our armor is most vulnerable. The fuel load presents an unacceptable vulnerability. Resources would be better allocated to increasing production of standard Sherman variants or expediting deployment of the M26 Pershing heavy tank. These weren't unreasonable concerns. The flamethrower Sherman would indeed be vulnerable at close range. The fuel tanks, despite protective measures, represented a catastrophic vulnerability if penetrated, and the weapon's effectiveness was, at this stage, largely theoretical, based on limited combat experience with man-portable flamethrowers and extrapolation from British crocodile operations. But the program had powerful advocates. General Holland, howling mad Smith, commander of Marine forces in the Pacific, had seen the carnage of bunker assaults firsthand. His endorsement was unequivocal. "Give me a battalion of flamethrower tanks and I'll save 1,000 Marine lives in the next operation. The mathematics are simple. We can either burn the enemy out or dig them out with our dead. I prefer the former." The turning point came in September 1944, when a prototype M4A3R3 was demonstrated at Aberdeen Proving Ground before a gathering of senior Army and Marine Corps officers. The demonstration target was a reinforced concrete bunker constructed to German specifications, with walls 1.5 meters thick and firing ports protected by steel shutters. The demonstration was devastating. The Sherman approached to within 40 yards, its main gun firing high explosive rounds to suppress any hypothetical defenders. Then the flamethrower engaged. A jet of burning fuel, pressurized to shoot in a coherent stream, lanced across the distance and poured directly into the bunker's firing port. Within seconds, flames were visible through every opening. The temperature inside the bunker, measured by instruments, exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius. Any personnel inside would have been killed within moments. either by the flames themselves, by oxygen deprivation, or by the toxic gases produced by the burning fuel. But the most striking effect was psychological. Even the hardened officers watching the demonstration felt a visceral reaction to the sight of the bunker being consumed by fire. If this was the effect on observers who knew it was a demonstration, what would be the impact on enemy soldiers who saw this weapon approaching their position? Colonel Edwin Harding, who had been skeptical before the demonstration, changed his assessment immediately. "I have just witnessed the future of bunker warfare. This weapon doesn't just neutralize fortifications, it makes them death traps. The psychological impact alone may cause enemy forces to abandon prepared positions rather than face this. Recommend immediate full-scale production and deployment to both European and Pacific theaters." The race against time. By October 1944, the program received full authorization. The Rock Island Arsenal and Fisher Body Division were tasked with converting existing Sherman tanks to the flamethrower configuration. The goal was ambitious: produce 300 M4A3R3 units by January 1945, with priority allocation to Marine Corps units preparing for the invasion of Iwo Jima and Army units facing the Siegfried Line. The conversion process was complex but manageable. Existing Sherman tanks were pulled from depot stocks, stripped of their bow machine guns, and fitted with the flamethrower apparatus. The fuel tanks were installed in the hull, protected by additional armor plating where possible. The turret retained its standard 75mm gun, giving the tank a secondary conventional capability, critical for self-defense and for engaging targets beyond flamethrower range. Crew selection and training became a priority. Not every tanker was suited for flamethrower operations. The Army and Marines looked for crews with steady nerves, aggressive temperament, and the psychological resilience to wield such a weapon. Training emphasized close-range maneuvering, target identification, and coordination with infantry. Crews practiced on mock-up bunkers, learning to identify vulnerable points, firing ports, ventilation shafts, entrances where flame could penetrate. The fuel mixture itself underwent continuous refinement. The napalm thickening agent, originally developed for aerial incendiary bombs, was adjusted to optimize burning temperature, adhesion to surfaces, and stream coherence. The final mixture would stick to whatever it touched and burn at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius for several minutes, long enough to ensure that anything organic inside a bunker was destroyed. By December 1944, the first operational M4A3R3 units were ready for deployment. 12 tanks were allocated to the 2nd Armored Division, preparing for operations against the Siegfried Line. Another 20 were en route to Marine Corps units in the Pacific. The weapon that would transform bunker warfare was about to enter combat. But neither the American commanders nor the German defenders yet understood the full implications of what was coming. The Germans, confident in their fortifications, continued to believe that their bunker complexes represented impregnable barriers. They had faced flamethrowers before, individual soldiers with backpack units easily killed by rifle fire. The concept of an armored mobile flamethrower platform that could approach under fire and deliver sustained flame attacks was outside their tactical framework. In a captured German intelligence report dated December 10, 1944, an analyst dismissed reports of American flamethrower tanks as likely exaggeration or misidentification of standard Sherman tanks using smoke generators. The report concluded, "Our fortified positions remain secure against known American capabilities. Recommend continued emphasis on anti-tank defense and maintenance of current defensive doctrine." It was a fatal miscalculation. The dragon was coming, and the concrete fortresses that had seemed so impregnable were about to become tombs. The frozen hell of the Hürtgen Forest. The first operational deployment of the M4A3R3 flamethrower tanks came not in the carefully planned offensive operations that strategists had envisioned, but in the midst of one of the most brutal and chaotic battles of the entire Western Front, the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest. By early December 1944, American forces had been grinding through this dense, nightmarish woodland for nearly 3 months, suffering catastrophic casualties against German defensive positions that turned every clearing, every trail, every village into a killing ground. The forest itself was an enemy. Dense stands of fir trees created a perpetual twilight even at midday. The canopy was so thick that artillery airbursts, normally devastating against infantry, detonated harmlessly in the treetops, raining shrapnel and wooden splinters down indiscriminately on both sides. Visibility was measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. Tanks could barely maneuver off the few muddy trails, and those trails were pre-registered by German artillery and covered by interlocking fields of fire from bunkers built into the hillsides. The German defenders had transformed the Hürtgen into a fortress in depth. Concrete bunkers, some dating back to the pre-war Siegfried Line construction, others built more recently, dotted the landscape. They were positioned with diabolical cleverness on reverse slopes to avoid direct fire, in defilade positions protected by terrain, mutually supporting so that an assault on one bunker would be met by fire from 2 or 3 others. The 275th Infantry Division, defending this sector, had been bled white in previous fighting but remained fanatically determined. They knew they were defending the approaches to the fatherland itself. Lieutenant Thomas Hürtgen, commander of the 2nd Platoon, Charlie Company, 67th Armored Regiment, received his orders on December 8, 1944. His platoon consisted of 4 M4A3R3 flamethrower tanks, call signs Zippo-1 through Zippo-4, and they were being attached to the 8th Infantry Division for an assault on a bunker complex designated Objective Raven, a cluster of 5 interconnected German positions that had repulsed 3 previous American attacks. Hürtgen's war diary, preserved in the National Archives, captures his initial reaction. Received the new tanks yesterday. Crews are nervous. Half of them have never seen a flamethrower tank before, let alone operated one. The fuel tanks make everyone uneasy. One penetrating hit, and we're cremated. But after seeing what happened to Baker Company last week, 43 men lost trying to take a single bunker, I'll take any weapon that gives us an edge. We move out at 0600 tomorrow. God help us all. The first contact. The morning of December 9th dawned cold and grey, with a light snow beginning to fall. The attack plan was straightforward in concept, nightmarish in execution. A battalion of infantry would advance under covering fire from conventional artillery and tank destroyers. Once they had suppressed the German positions and identified the bunker locations, Hürtgen's flamethrower tanks would move forward to neutralize the fortifications. The reality was chaos from the first moment. The infantry jumped off at 06:15, immediately running into a minefield that the engineers had failed to completely clear. Explosions rippled through the lead company. German machine guns opened up from concealed positions, their MG-42s creating that distinctive sound American soldiers called Hitler's buzzsaw. Men fell in windows, cut down before they could even identify where the fire was coming from. Hürtgen's tanks were positioned 200 yards behind the infantry start line, engines idling, crews tense. Through his periscope, Hürtgen could see the infantry assault faltering, men going to ground, medics crawling forward to reach the wounded. The radio crackled with desperate calls for support, for smoke, for anything that could suppress the German fire. "Zippo-1, this is Bulldog 6, came the voice of the infantry battalion commander. "We're pinned down. Can you see the bunker positions? We need you forward now." Hürtgen felt his stomach tighten. The plan had called for the infantry to mark the bunker positions with colored smoke before the tanks advanced. But the infantry was pinned down, taking casualties, and couldn't get close enough to mark anything. The flamethrower tanks would have to advance into a confused battlefield, identify targets on their own, and engage under fire. "Zippo 2, 3, 4, this is Zippo 1, Hürtgen transmitted. We're moving forward. Stay in column, 20-yard intervals. Watch for anti-tank fire. Gunners, keep your eyes open for bunker positions. Look for muzzle flashes, firing ports, anything concrete. The 4 Shermans lurched forward, tracks churning through the muddy snow. The sound of their engines was immediately answered by German fire. Bullets pinged off the armor, rifle rounds, ineffective but unnerving. Then came the heavier impacts of anti-tank rifle fire, still not penetrating, but leaving bright scars on the steel. Sergeant Mike Kowalski, commanding Zippo 2, spotted it first. A low concrete structure, partially concealed by camouflage netting and fallen logs, perhaps 60 yards to the left of the trail. Muzzle flashes flickered from a narrow firing port as a German machine gun raked the pinned-down American infantry. Zippo 1, this is 2. I have a bunker. 11 o'clock, 60 yards. Engaging. Kowalski's tank pivoted, the driver skillfully maneuvering around a shell crater. The turret traversed, bringing the 75mm gun to bear. A high-explosive round slammed into the bunker's facade, blowing away the camouflage and revealing the full structure. A reinforced concrete pillbox, with walls at least a meter thick. The machine gun inside fell silent for a moment, then resumed firing. The HE round had done superficial damage, but hadn't penetrated. "Flamethrower ready," reported Corporal Danny Chen, Zippo 2's flamethrower operator. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly on the controls. This would be his first time firing the weapon in combat. "Range 50 yards. Fire when ready," Kowalski ordered. Chen pressed the trigger. There was a whooshing roar as pressurized fuel shot through the barrel, ignited by the electric spark. A jet of flame, brilliant orange and yellow even in the grey daylight, arced across the distance and struck the bunker's firing port with perfect accuracy. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. Flame poured into the narrow opening, spreading inside the confined space. Within seconds, black smoke began billowing from the firing port and from ventilation shafts that hadn't been visible before. The machine gun fell silent. Then came the screaming, high-pitched, agonized shrieks that carried across the battlefield, even over the sound of gunfire. Chen fired again, a second burst that lasted 3 seconds, pouring more burning fuel into the bunker. The screaming stopped. Smoke continued to pour from every opening. The bunker was neutralized. "Target destroyed," Kowalski reported, his voice flat. He had just killed men by burning them alive, and the reality of it was settling on him like a weight. But there was no time for reflection. 2 more bunkers had been identified, and German anti-tank fire was intensifying. A Panzerfaust rocket streaked past Zippo 3, missing by inches. The German defenders had realized what they were facing and were reacting with desperate aggression. The crucible of close combat. Harrigan's Zippo 1 advanced toward the second bunker, a larger structure built into a hillside, with a clear field of fire covering the main trail. This was the position that had stopped the previous American attacks, its interlocking fire with other bunkers creating a kill zone that nothing had been able to cross. As Harrigan's tank approached, a German soldier emerged from a concealed foxhole barely 20 yards away, a Panzerfaust on his shoulder. Harrigan saw him through the periscope, saw the German taking aim at Zippo 1's vulnerable side armor. "Gunner Koch's infantry right!" Harrigan shouted. The bow machine gunner swiveled and fired a burst from the 30 caliber coaxial machine gun. The German soldier fell, the Panzerfaust unfired, but the moment had cost precious seconds. The bunker's machine gun opened up, bullets hammering against Zippo 1's frontal armor. At this range, less than 40 yards, even machine gun fire could potentially find weak points, vision ports, or the vulnerable junction between hull and turret. "Flamethrower ready," reported Private First Class Eddie Morrison, Harrigan's operator. "Range 35 yards. "Fire!" The jet of flame shot forward, but Morrison's aim was slightly off. The stream struck the bunker's wall just to the left of the firing port. Burning fuel splashed against the concrete, some of it flowing down and pooling at the base of the structure, but the main stream hadn't entered the bunker. "Adjust right. Fire again," Harrigan ordered. Morrison corrected his aim. The second burst was perfect. Flame poured directly into the firing port, and once again came that terrible transformation. A fortified position turned into a crematorium, but this bunker was larger, with a bigger garrison. The screaming was louder, more voices, and it lasted longer before finally cutting off. Hürtgen felt bile rise in his throat. He had killed before, with the tank's main gun, with machine guns, but this was different. This was intimate in a way that other forms of killing were not. He could hear them dying. "Target neutralized," he reported mechanically. "Zippo 3-4 status." Zippo 3 had engaged a third bunker with similar results, but Zippo 4 had run into trouble. A concealed German anti-tank gun, probably a 75mm Apache 40, had scored a hit on Zippo 4's right track, immobilizing the tank. The crew was bailing out under fire, running for cover as German infantry tried to close in for the kill. "Zippo 2, cover 4's crew, Zippo 3, with me on the remaining bunkers," Hürtgen ordered. The battle devolved into a close-range brawl. German infantry, realizing that the flamethrower tanks were vulnerable to close assault, emerged from concealed positions with panzerfausts and magnetic mines. American infantry, no longer pinned down now that the bunkers were being neutralized, advanced to protect the tanks, engaging the German soldiers in brutal close-quarters combat. Hürtgen's tank engaged 2 more bunkers, each time with that same terrible efficiency. The flamethrower proved devastatingly effective. No bunker could withstand it, but the cost was becoming apparent. The tanks had to get dangerously close, exposing themselves to anti-tank fire. The fuel consumption was prodigious. After 5 engagements, Morrison reported that Zippo 1's fuel tanks were below 50%, and there was the psychological toll. Every time Morrison pressed that trigger, every time they heard the screaming from inside the bunkers, something inside each crew member died a little. This wasn't clean killing at a distance. This was burning men alive in confined spaces, and the sounds and smells would haunt them forever. The aftermath and the reckoning. By 1400 hours, Objective Raven was secured. 5 German bunkers had been destroyed, along with numerous fighting positions. The 8th Infantry Division had achieved in 6 hours what 3 previous attacks over 2 weeks had failed to accomplish. But the cost had been significant. Zippo 4 was a total loss, destroyed by anti-tank fire. Its crew had survived, but 2 were wounded. Zippo 3 had taken multiple hits that, while not penetrating, had damaged external equipment and wounded the tank commander with shrapnel. Zippo 1 and 2 were operational, but had expended more than 60% of their fuel. The infantry casualties had been lighter than in previous attacks. 23 men killed or wounded, compared to over 100 in the last assault on this position. The German casualties were difficult to assess. The bunkers contained charred remains that were barely identifiable as human. Prisoners were few. Most German soldiers had fought to the death or died in the flames. Lieutenant Hürtgen sat on the rear deck of his tank, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. His uniform was soaked with sweat despite the cold. The smell of burned fuel and burned flesh clung to everything. Captain Robert Marsh, the infantry company commander, approached. His face was haggard, aged 10 years in a single day, but there was something like gratitude in his eyes. "Your tank saved my company today, Lieutenant. We'd have lost 50 men trying to take those bunkers the conventional way. Maybe more." Hürtgen nodded but couldn't find words. He had saved American lives, that was undeniable. But the method, the screaming, the smell, it was a price he hadn't anticipated paying. "The weapon works," Marsh continued. "It's horrible, but it works. The Germans can't stand against it. Word is going to spread fast, on both sides." That night, Hürtgen wrote in his diary, "We burned them out. 5 bunkers, probably 30 or 40 men. The weapon is effective beyond anything I imagined, but I can't stop hearing them scream." Morrison threw up after the 4th bunker. "Chen won't talk to anyone. We saved American lives today. I have to keep telling myself that." but I wonder what we've become in the process. The Germans built those bunkers to be impregnable, and they were, against everything except fire. Now they know, and I think they're terrified. Good. Maybe terror will save more lives than killing, but I doubt I'll sleep tonight. The baptism by fire of the M4A3R3 flamethrower tanks was complete. The weapon had proven its tactical effectiveness beyond doubt, but it had also revealed the psychological burden it would place on the crews who operated it and the enemy soldiers who faced it. The Dragon had entered the battlefield, and warfare in the Hürtgen Forest, and soon across the entire Western Front, would never be the same. The reports that made no sense. In a dimly lit command bunker 15 kilometers behind the front lines, Oberst Heinrich Vogel, intelligence officer for the 275th Infantry Division, stared at the field reports scattered across his makeshift desk with growing bewilderment. The date was December 11th, 1944, and the reports from the Hürtgen sector were unlike anything he had encountered in 5 years of war. The first report, from Lieutenant Klaus Weber of the 3rd Company, had arrived via runner the previous evening. Weber's unit had been positioned in a secondary defensive line, close enough to observe the American assault on Objective Raven, but not directly engaged. His account was detailed but contained elements that seemed impossible. At approximately 0730 hours, American armor advanced toward our forward positions. Initial identification suggested standard M4 Sherman tanks. However, upon engaging our bunker complexes, these vehicles deployed a weapon system previously unobserved. Instead of conventional tank fire, they projected streams of burning liquid at ranges estimated between 40 to 60 meters. The effect on our fortified positions was catastrophic. Bunker Stellung 14 was engulfed in flames within seconds. Radio contact was lost immediately. Survivors reported temperatures inside adjacent positions became unbearable, even at distances of 30 meters. Recommend immediate tactical reassessment of bunker defense doctrine. Vogel had initially dismissed the report as combat stress or misidentification. Perhaps the Americans had used smoke generators or phosphorus rounds that Weber, in the chaos of battle, had mistaken for something more exotic. But then came the second report from Feldwebel Otto Krause, a veteran NCO with 3 years of Eastern Front experience, a man not prone to exaggeration or panic. Krause's report was more disturbing. The American weapon is unlike anything encountered against Soviet forces. It is not artillery, not conventional tank fire, not infantry flamethrowers. The tanks approach to close range, suicidally close by normal armor doctrine, and discharge sustained streams of burning fuel directly into bunker apertures. Our MG positions, previously impervious to American attacks, were neutralized in seconds. The psychological effect on surviving personnel is severe. Men are refusing to occupy forward bunkers, claiming they would rather face artillery in open trenches than be cooked alive in concrete ovens. Morale is critically compromised. By December 11th, Vogel had received 7 separate reports from different units, all describing the same phenomenon. The Americans had deployed armored flamethrowers, and they were systematically destroying the defensive positions that had held the Hürtgen Forest for months. Vogel drafted his assessment for division headquarters, choosing his words carefully. He was a professional officer, trained to analyze intelligence objectively, but even he struggled to convey the implications of what he was reading. Intelligence Summary 4744. American forces have introduced a new weapons system, armored vehicles mounting long-range flamethrowers. Preliminary assessment suggests these are modified M4 Sherman tanks with flamethrower apparatus replacing bow machine gun. Effective range appears to be 50-80 meters, significantly exceeding man-portable flamethrower systems. Impact on defensive operations is severe. Recommend immediate dissemination to all commands and urgent development of countermeasures. The doctrinal collision. The report reached the headquarters of Heeresgruppe B, Army Group B, on December 13th, where it landed on the desk of General Major Rudolf Hoffmann, Chief of Operations. Hoffmann was a product of the German military system, methodical, doctrinally rigid, and deeply invested in the defensive strategy that had, until now, been bleeding the Americans white in the Hürtgen Forest. His initial reaction was skepticism, bordering on dismissal. Flamethrowers were infantry weapons, short-ranged and vulnerable. The idea of mounting them on tanks seemed tactically absurd. Tanks were meant to engage at distance, using their armor and firepower to dominate the battlefield. Closing to within 50 meters of enemy positions was suicide. Any competent anti-tank team could destroy a tank at that range with Panzerfausts or telemines. Hoffmann convened a meeting of his staff officers to assess the reports. The discussion revealed the deep doctrinal confusion the American weapon had created. The reports must be exaggerated, argued Major Ernst Dietrich, the operations officer. No tank commander would deliberately close to such ranges. Our anti-tank defenses are specifically designed to destroy enemy armor at these distances. The Americans would be sacrificing their tanks for minimal gain. But Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner, who had just returned from a liaison visit to forward units, offered a different perspective. I have spoken with survivors from the bunker positions. Their accounts are consistent and credible. The American tanks do close to extreme ranges, but they do so under covering fire from artillery and infantry. By the time they reach flamethrower range, our bunker crews are already suppressed, unable to effectively engage with anti-tank weapons. And once the flamethrower engages, Steiner paused, his face grim. There is no defense. The bunker becomes a death trap. Hoffmann studied the map of the Hürtgen sector, his mind working through the tactical implications. The entire German defensive strategy in the West was predicated on fortified positions. From the Atlantic Wall to the Siegfried Line, from the Gothic Line in Italy to countless bunker complexes across occupied Europe, the Wehrmacht had invested enormous resources in concrete fortifications. These positions were force multipliers, allowing undermanned German units to hold against numerically superior Allied forces. But if the Americans had developed a weapon that could neutralize bunkers quickly and efficiently, the entire defensive calculus collapsed. Suddenly, those concrete fortifications weren't assets, they were tombs. "What countermeasures do we have?" Hoffmann asked. The silence that followed was answer enough. Finally, Major Dietrich spoke. Conventional anti-tank tactics should be effective. Panzerfausts, telemines, concealed anti-tank guns positioned to engage the flamethrower tanks before they reach effective range. We must prevent them from closing to within 50 meters of our positions. And if they do close, Hoffmann pressed. Another silence. Then Steiner said quietly, "Then the bunker is lost, Herr General Major. There is no surviving a direct flamethrower attack in a confined space. The men inside have perhaps 5 seconds from the moment the flame enters until they are dead or incapacitated. Evacuation is impossible." Hoffmann felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. He had fought on the Eastern Front, had seen the worst that modern warfare could inflict. But this was different. This was a weapon that turned Germany's greatest defensive asset into a liability. "Draft new tactical guidelines," he ordered. "All bunker positions must be supported by dedicated anti-tank teams with orders to prioritize these flamethrower tanks, increase the density of minefields around fortified positions, and—" he hesitated, knowing how his next words would be received, "begin planning for alternative defensive configurations that do not rely solely on static bunker positions." It was a tacit admission that the American weapon had fundamentally altered the tactical landscape. But Hoffmann was a realist. Doctrine had to adapt to reality, or men would die for nothing. The whispers in the ranks. While the German High Command struggled to comprehend the tactical implications of the flamethrower tanks, the psychological impact was spreading through the frontline units like a contagion. Soldiers who had felt secure behind concrete and steel now felt trapped and vulnerable. Gefreiter Hans Müller, a machine gunner in the 89th Infantry Division, wrote in a letter to his wife, intercepted by Allied intelligence and translated, "The Americans have brought a new devil to the battlefield. They have tanks that breathe fire like dragons from the old stories. Our bunkers, which we thought would protect us, have become ovens. Yesterday, I heard the screaming from Bunker 7 when the fire came. It lasted only seconds, but I will hear it for the rest of my life. The officers tell us to hold our positions, but how can we fight fire? How can concrete walls protect us from something that pours through every opening like water? I am more afraid now than I have ever been, even in Russia." The letter was one of dozens intercepted in mid-December, all expressing similar sentiments: fear, confusion, and a growing sense that the defensive positions they occupied were no longer sanctuaries but potential death traps. German commanders began reporting a disturbing trend. Soldiers were increasingly reluctant to occupy forward bunker positions, preferring to take their chances in open trenches or foxholes, where they could at least retreat if attacked. This reluctance was particularly pronounced among units that had witnessed flamethrower attacks or heard accounts from survivors. Oberst Vogel, in a follow-up intelligence report dated December 18th, noted, "The psychological impact of the American flamethrower tanks exceeds their tactical impact. While the actual number of bunkers destroyed remains relatively limited, the fear of these weapons is affecting defensive operations across the entire sector. Soldiers who would previously hold bunker positions to the last man are now abandoning positions at the first sign of American armor. The weapon's reputation has become as dangerous as the weapon itself." The failed countermeasures. The German response, when it came, was hampered by limited resources and the fundamental mismatch between their anti-tank doctrine and the reality of flamethrower tank operations. Traditional anti-tank tactics assumed that enemy armor would engage at ranges of 500 meters or more, giving defenders time to identify, target, and destroy the threat. But the flamethrower tanks operated differently. They advanced under heavy covering fire, often obscured by smoke, and closed rapidly to their effective range. By the time German anti-tank teams could engage, the tanks were already in position to use their flamethrowers. On December 20th, a German anti-tank team from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division attempted to ambush a group of American flamethrower tanks near the village of Kleinhau. The team, consisting of 4 soldiers with 2 Panzerfausts and a Teller mine, positioned themselves in a concealed position overlooking the approach route. The after-action report, filed by the sole survivor, Gefreiter Paul Schmidt, illustrated the difficulty of countering the new American tactics. "We observed 4 American tanks approaching at approximately 1100 hours. We identified them as the flamethrower variant by the modified bow configuration. We waited until they reached optimal range, approximately 40 meters, before Unteroffizier Becker engaged with his Panzerfaust. His shot struck the lead tank but failed to penetrate. The rocket hit at an oblique angle and deflected. Before we could reload, the American infantry supporting the tanks identified our position and engaged with rifle fire and grenades. Simultaneously, one of the flamethrower tanks traversed toward our position and fired. The flame did not reach us directly, but the heat and smoke forced us to abandon our position. In the confusion, Becker and the others were killed by American infantry. I escaped only by fleeing through a drainage culvert. Similar reports accumulated throughout late December. German anti-tank teams found that the flamethrower tanks, while vulnerable in theory, were extremely difficult to destroy in practice. They were supported by infantry, covered by smoke and suppressive fire, and operated in terrain that limited fields of fire. Moreover, the psychological pressure of facing a weapon that could incinerate you in seconds affected even veteran soldiers' ability to aim and fire effectively. The German High Command issued increasingly desperate tactical directives. One, dated December 22nd, ordered All anti-tank teams engaging American flamethrower tanks must prioritize these targets above all others. Flamethrower tanks are to be engaged at maximum range before they can close to effective flamethrower distance. Failure to destroy these vehicles before they reach bunker positions will result in catastrophic losses. But directives could not change the fundamental tactical reality. The Americans had developed a weapon specifically designed to neutralize fortified positions, and the Germans had no effective counter. The intelligence failure. Perhaps the most damaging aspect of the German response was the initial failure to recognize the strategic implications of the flamethrower tanks. German intelligence had known that the Americans were experimenting with flamethrower vehicles. British Churchill crocodiles had been encountered in Normandy. But the assumption had been that these were specialized weapons of limited deployment, useful only in specific circumstances. The reality that the Americans were producing flamethrower Shermans in significant numbers and deploying them across multiple theaters was not fully appreciated until late December. By then, the weapon had already begun to undermine German defensive operations in the Hürtgen Forest and was being deployed to other sectors. A captured German intelligence assessment from December 28, 1944, revealed the extent of the miscalculation. Previous estimates of American flamethrower tank production were grossly inadequate. Current intelligence suggests at least 200-300 vehicles have been produced, with deployments confirmed in the Hürtgen sector, the Saar region, and reportedly in the Pacific Theater. The weapon is not a specialized tool for specific operations, but a standard component of American combined arms tactics. Our defensive doctrine, which relies heavily on fortified positions, is fundamentally compromised. Urgent reassessment of strategic defensive planning is required. But by late December 1944, the German military was in no position to undertake fundamental strategic reassessments. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies, was consuming all available reserves. Resources that might have been used to develop countermeasures to the flamethrower tanks were instead being thrown into a doomed offensive that would ultimately accelerate Germany's collapse. The flamethrower tanks had created a crisis in German defensive doctrine at precisely the moment when Germany could least afford such a crisis. The concrete bunkers that had been built to protect the fatherland had become traps, and the soldiers ordered to defend them knew it. Morale, already fragile after years of retreat and defeat, cracked further under the psychological weight of facing a weapon against which there seemed to be no defense. In the frozen forests and shattered villages of the Western Front, German soldiers looked at their bunkers with new eyes, not as fortresses, but as potential crematoriums. And when they heard the rumble of tank engines approaching through the smoke and snow, they wondered, was it a regular Sherman, or was it one of the dragons that breathed fire? The answer to that question could mean the difference between life and a death too horrible to contemplate. The crisis at the Roer River. By early January 1945, the M4A3R3 flamethrower tanks had proven their tactical value beyond doubt, but they had also revealed critical vulnerabilities that threatened to limit their effectiveness. The crisis came to a head during operations along the Roer River, where American forces were preparing to cross into Germany proper and breach the final defensive lines protecting the industrial Ruhr region. The German defenders, having learned painful lessons from the Hürtgen Forest, had adapted their tactics with desperate ingenuity. Rather than relying solely on static bunker defenses, they had created a defense in depth. Multiple layers of fortifications, extensive minefields, pre-registered artillery zones, and most critically, dedicated anti-tank hunter-killer teams specifically tasked with destroying the flamethrower Shermans before they could reach effective range. On January 8, 1945, during an assault on the fortified town of Düren, the limitations of the flamethrower tanks became brutally apparent. Captain James Morrison, now commanding a full company of 12 M4A3R3 tanks, led his unit in support of the 78th Infantry Division's attack on the town's outer defenses. The operation was supposed to be a textbook application of the new combined arms doctrine. Infantry and conventional armor would suppress German positions, while the flamethrower tanks moved forward to neutralize the bunker complexes. Instead, it became a nightmare. The Germans had seeded the approach routes with a density of anti-tank mines that exceeded anything previously encountered. The first flamethrower tank, call-sign Dragon 6, struck a teller mine barely 100 meters into the advance. The explosion shattered the right track and immobilized the vehicle. As the crew attempted to bail out, German machine gun fire from concealed positions cut down 2 of the 5 crew members before they could reach cover. Dragon 3 made it another 200 meters before a concealed 75mm anti-tank gun, positioned in a partially destroyed building and camouflaged with rubble, scored a direct hit on the tank's left side. The round penetrated the hull armor and ignited the flamethrower fuel tanks. The resulting explosion was catastrophic, a fireball that rose 50 feet into the air, consuming the tank and its entire crew in seconds. The very weapon that made the tank so deadly had become its death sentence. Captain Morrison, watching from Dragon 1, felt his blood turn to ice. In less than 5 minutes he had lost 2 tanks and 9 men. The remaining flamethrower tanks were still 300 meters from the nearest bunker, far beyond effective flamethrower range, and the approach was a gauntlet of mines, anti-tank guns, and Panzerfaust teams. All Dragon units, halt advance, Morrison ordered, his voice tight with controlled fury. We're sitting ducks out here. Fall back to rally point Alpha. The withdrawal was almost as costly as the advance. Dragon 8 threw a track while reversing, becoming immobilized in the open. German artillery, pre-registered on the likely withdrawal routes, began falling with devastating accuracy. The crew of Dragon 8 abandoned their vehicle and ran for cover through a storm of shrapnel and machine gun fire. Only 3 of the 5 made it. By the time Morrison's company reached the relative safety of the American lines, they had lost 4 tanks destroyed or immobilized, with 14 crew members killed or wounded. They had not destroyed a single German bunker. The operation was a complete failure, and Morrison knew that if the flamethrower tanks couldn't adapt to the German countermeasures, they would become expensive coffins rather than war-winning weapons. The Midnight Council. That night, in a commandeered farmhouse serving as a forward command post, an impromptu council of war convened. Present were Captain Morrison, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hendricks, battalion commander, Major Thomas Chen, battalion operations officer, and critically, Master Sergeant Vincent Vinnie Calabrese, a tank maintenance NCO with 15 years of service and a reputation for mechanical genius. The mood was grim. Hendricks opened the discussion bluntly. Gentlemen, we have a problem. The flamethrower tanks worked beautifully in the Hürtgen because the Germans weren't prepared for them. Now they are. They've adapted their tactics, and we're losing tanks and crews at an unsustainable rate. Division is asking whether we should pull the flamethrower units out of the line until we can develop better tactics. Morrison shook his head emphatically. Sir, with respect, that's exactly the wrong response. The weapon still works when we can get it into range. The problem isn't the flamethrower, it's getting close enough to use it. The Germans have figured out that if they can stop us at 200-300 meters, we're just regular Shermans with a vulnerability, those fuel tanks. So what's the solution? Hendricks asked. We can't magic away the mines and anti-tank guns. It was Sergeant Calabrese who spoke up, his Brooklyn accent thick and his tone thoughtful. Captain, I've been thinking about this. The problem is we're using the flame tanks like they're assault guns, leading the advance, first through the breach. But that ain't what they are. They're specialized tools, right? You don't use a precision instrument as a sledgehammer. Go on, Hendricks said, leaning forward. What if we flip the script? Calabrese continued, warming to his theme. Use the regular Shermans and tank destroyers to suppress the German positions and clear the approach routes. Use combat engineers to breach the minefields under covering fire. Get the infantry forward to suppress the anti-tank teams. Only then, when we've created a corridor, do the flame tanks move up for the final assault on the bunkers. We're using them as finishers, not as breaching tools. Morrison felt a spark of hope. That could work. The Germans are concentrating their anti-tank defenses on stopping our initial advance because they assume the flame tanks will be in the first wave. If we hold them back until the situation is more controlled, Major Chen was already sketching on a map. We'd need better coordination with the engineers, and we'd need smoke, lots of it, to cover the final approach of the flame tanks. But yes, this could work. We're essentially creating a protected corridor for the specialized weapons. Hendricks nodded slowly. It's more complex, requires better coordination, and it's slower. But if it saves tanks and crews while still getting the job done, I'm willing to try it. Morrison, work up a detailed tactical plan. We'll test it in the next operation. But Calabresi wasn't finished. There's another thing, sir, the fuel tanks. They're the Achilles heel. One penetrating hit and the whole tank goes up like a Roman candle. What if we add more armor protection around the fuel tanks? I know it'll add weight, but if it prevents catastrophic kills... The suspension can't handle much more weight, Morrison objected. The Sherman's already overloaded. Not thick armor, Calabresi countered. Spaced armor. Thin plates mounted a few inches away from the fuel tanks. When an anti-tank round hits, it detonates on the outer plate, and the inner plate catches the fragments. It won't stop everything, but it might prevent the fuel tanks from being penetrated by anything except a direct, heavy-caliber hit. Hendricks looked at Chen. Is that feasible? We'd need to fabricate the armor plates, but yes, it's doable. We have a maintenance depot with welding equipment about 10 kilometers back. If Sergeant Calabresi thinks he can design and install the modifications, give me 3 days and access to the depot, sir, Calabresi said confidently. I'll armor up every flame tank in the battalion. Do it, Hendricks ordered. Morrison, you have 48 hours to develop the new tactical doctrine. We test both the new tactics and the armor modifications in the next operation. If it works, we'll disseminate it to every flamethrower unit in the theater. If it doesn't, He didn't finish the sentence. They all knew what failure would mean. The improvisation Sergeant Calabresi worked with the manic energy of a man possessed. He commandeered a team of mechanics and welders from the maintenance depot and set them to work fabricating armor plates from salvaged steel, pieces of destroyed German tanks, sections of structural steel from bombed buildings, even thick steel plates from industrial machinery found in abandoned factories. The design was ingenious in its simplicity. Thin steel plates, 10-15 mm thick, were mounted on brackets that held them 15 to 20 centimeters away from the hull armor, protecting the fuel tanks. The spacing was critical. It had to be enough to cause premature detonation of shape-charge warheads like those used in Panzerfausts, but not so much that it compromised the tank's mobility or made the armor too bulky. Private Eddie Morrison, no relation to Captain Morrison, a welder who had worked in a Detroit auto plant before the war, described the process in a letter home. Sarge Calabresi is a madman, but a genius madman. We're working 18-hour shifts, welding armor plates onto these flame tanks. It's not pretty, looks like we're building tanks out of scrap metal, but Sarge says it doesn't have to be pretty, just has to work. The theory is that when a German rocket hits the outer plate, it explodes before it can penetrate to the fuel tanks. I hope he's right, because if he's wrong, some poor tanker is going to burn to death anyway, just with more metal around him. The modifications added approximately 800 pounds to each tank, not ideal, but within acceptable limits. The suspension groaned under the extra weight, and the tank's top speed decreased slightly, but they remained mobile and functional. While Calabresi worked on the armor, Captain Morrison refined the tactical doctrine. The new approach, which he designated Cascade Assault Protocol, divided the attack into distinct phases. Phase 1, suppression and breaching. Conventional armor, tank destroyers, and artillery would engage German positions at range, suppressing anti-tank guns and machine gun nests. Combat engineers would advance under this covering fire to breach minefields and clear obstacles. Phase 2, infantry advance. Infantry units would move forward through the breached corridors, engaging German anti-tank teams and securing the flanks. Smoke generators would create a screen to obscure the battlefield. Phase 3, flamethrower assault. Only after the approach routes were secured and the immediate anti-tank threat neutralized would the flamethrower tanks advance. They would move quickly through the smoke screen, close to effective range, and engage the bunker positions. Phase 4, consolidation. Once the bunkers were neutralized, infantry would occupy the positions while the flamethrower tanks withdrew to covered positions for refueling and rearming. The doctrine required precise timing, excellent communication, and trust between the different combat arms. It was more complex than the previous approach, but complexity was preferable to the casualty rates they had been suffering. The proving ground. On January 14, 1945, the new tactics and armor modifications were tested in an assault on a fortified German position designated Objective Hammer, a cluster of 6 bunkers protecting a key road junction near the village of Merzenich. The German defenders, elements of the 9th Panzer Division, were experienced and well prepared. The operation began at 600 hours with a 30-minute artillery barrage that pulverized the area around the bunkers. Then the tank destroyers moved forward, engaging any German anti-tank positions that revealed themselves. The Germans, expecting the flamethrower tanks to follow immediately, held their fire, waiting for the more valuable targets. Combat engineers advanced under smoke cover, probing for mines with detectors and prodding rods. It was agonizingly slow work, and 2 engineers were killed by German sniper fire, but within 90 minutes they had cleared 2 corridors through the minefield. Then came the infantry, moving in squad rushes, using the smoke and the terrain for cover. German machine guns opened up, but American counterfire from supporting weapons suppressed them. The infantry pushed forward, getting within 100 meters of the bunker line, close enough to engage German anti-tank teams with rifle grenades and small arms fire. Only then did Captain Morrison give the order. All Dragon units, advance. Execute Phase 3. The 6 flamethrower tanks, now sporting their improvised spaced armor, surged forward through the smoke. They moved fast, drivers pushing the engines to maximum speed, covering the 200 meters to effective range in less than a minute. German anti-tank teams, realizing the flamethrower tanks were finally advancing, opened fire. A Panzerfaust rocket streaked toward Dragon 4. The rocket struck the spaced armor on the tank's left side. There was an explosion, a shower of sparks, but the tank kept moving. The spaced armor had worked, the shaped charge had detonated prematurely, and while the outer plate was blown away, the inner hull armor and the fuel tanks behind it remained intact. Dragon 4 reached its firing position and engaged the nearest bunker. The jet of flame poured through the bunker's firing port with the now familiar devastating effect. Within seconds, the position was neutralized. The other 5 flamethrower tanks engaged their targets in rapid succession. The Germans, their anti-tank defenses already suppressed by the earlier phases of the assault, could not stop them. Within 10 minutes, all 6 bunkers were destroyed or abandoned, their garrisons dead or fleeing. The assault had succeeded, and critically, not a single flamethrower tank had been lost. 2 had taken hits from Panzerfausts, but the spaced armor had prevented catastrophic damage. Crews were shaken but alive, and the tanks were still operational. The validation. The after-action review was held that evening, and the mood was dramatically different from the grim council a week earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Hendricks addressed the assembled officers and NCOs with barely contained satisfaction. "Gentlemen, Today, we proved that adaptation wins wars. The Germans adapted to our flamethrower tanks, and we adapted to their adaptations. The Cascade Assault Protocol works. The armor modifications work. We achieved our objective with 0 tank losses and minimal casualties. This is the template going forward. He turned to Sergeant Calabresi. Sergeant, your armor modification is being adopted as standard for all flamethrower tanks in the European theater. You've probably saved hundreds of lives. Well done. Calabresi, embarrassed by the attention, simply nodded. Just doing my job, sir. Keeping the boys alive and the tanks running. Captain Morrison added his own assessment. The key lesson is coordination. The flamethrower tank is a specialized tool that requires the right conditions to be effective. We create those conditions through combined arms, artillery, armor, engineers, infantry, all working together. The Germans can't defend against everything simultaneously. We overwhelm their defenses in stages, and by the time the flame tanks arrive, the Germans can't stop them. Until the success at Objective Hammer was rapidly disseminated throughout the theater. Within 2 weeks, every flamethrower tank unit in Europe had received copies of the Cascade Assault Protocol and instructions for fabricating spaced armor. Maintenance units worked around the clock to modify the tanks using whatever materials were available. The improvised armor became a point of pride for the crews. Each tank's spaced armor was slightly different depending on what materials the maintenance teams had scavenged. Some tanks sported armor plates from destroyed Panthers, others had sections of industrial steel, still others had improvised plates welded together from multiple sources. The tanks looked rough, almost cobbled together, but they worked. One crew painted a motto on their tank's spaced armor: "Homemade but deadly." Another painted tally marks for each bunker destroyed. The flamethrower tanks, once viewed with a mixture of awe and dread, were becoming symbols of American ingenuity and adaptability. But perhaps the most significant impact was psychological. The German defenders, who had briefly believed they had found a way to counter the flamethrower tanks, now faced an enemy that had adapted faster than they could respond. The bunkers were death traps again, and the concrete walls offered no protection against the flames. In a captured German document dated January 20th, 1945, a battalion commander wrote to his superiors, "The American flamethrower tanks have returned, but they are more dangerous than before. They now advance under heavy support, making anti-tank engagement extremely difficult. Our soldiers report that the tanks appear to have additional armor that defeats our Panzerfausts. Morale continues to deteriorate. Men are abandoning bunker positions without orders, preferring to retreat rather than face the flames. Recommend immediate withdrawal to secondary defensive lines before cohesion completely collapses." The crisis had been met with innovation, and innovation had prevailed. The flamethrower tanks, refined by combat experience and improved by battlefield improvisation, were now an unstoppable force. The Dragon had learned to protect itself, and the German defenses were crumbling before it. The Siegfried Line, Germany's last fortress. By late January 1945, the American advance had reached the Siegfried Line, the West Wall as the Germans called it, the final fortified barrier protecting the German heartland. This was not a single line of bunkers, but a defensive system in depth, stretching for nearly 400 miles along Germany's western border. It represented the culmination of pre-war German military engineering. Thousands of bunkers, dragon's teeth, anti-tank obstacles, extensive minefields, and interlocking fields of fire designed to make every meter of advance cost the Allies dearly in blood. The German High Command had invested enormous resources in the West Wall, believing it to be impregnable. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels had proclaimed in a radio broadcast on January 15th, "The West Wall stands as an iron shield protecting the fatherland. Let the enemy break themselves against our concrete and steel. Every bunker is a fortress, every soldier a hero. Germany will never surrender." But the soldiers manning those bunkers knew a truth that Goebbels's propaganda could not erase. The Americans had brought fire, and concrete offered no protection against flames. The assault on the Siegfried Line began in earnest on January 28, 1945, with Operation Undertone, a massive, coordinated offensive involving the U.S. 7th Army and elements of the 3rd Army. Among the assault forces were now 36 M4A3R3 flamethrower tanks, organized into 3 specialized companies and distributed across the attacking divisions. The lessons learned in the Hürtgen Forest and at the Roer River had been absorbed, refined, and disseminated. The American military machine had learned how to wield its dragon effectively. The Battle of Bunker Complex Schwarzwald. The most significant engagement came at a massive bunker complex designated Schwarzwald by German defenders. A cluster of 14 interconnected bunkers built into a hillside overlooking a critical road junction near the town of Zweibrücken. The complex had been constructed in 1938 as part of the original West Wall and had been continuously improved since. Its walls were 3 meters thick in places, reinforced with steel and designed to withstand sustained heavy artillery bombardment. The garrison consisted of 180 men from the 416th Infantry Division, supplemented by a platoon of combat engineers and an anti-tank section with 4 75mm Paquet 40 guns. The German commander, Hauptmann Wilhelm Brandt, was a veteran of the Eastern Front who had survived Stalingrad and the retreat across Ukraine. He was under no illusions about Germany's strategic situation, but he was determined to make the Americans pay for every meter. His defensive plan was sophisticated, incorporating all the lessons learned from previous encounters with flamethrower tanks. Brandt had positioned his anti-tank guns in carefully camouflaged positions with overlapping fields of fire, covering all likely approach routes. He had seeded the approaches with a dense network of telemines and improvised explosive devices. Most critically, he had organized mobile Panzerfaust teams with orders to remain concealed until the flamethrower tanks advanced, then emerge from hidden positions to engage at close range. "The Americans will come with their fire-breathing tanks," Brandt told his officers in a briefing on January 27th. "But those tanks must close to within 50 meters to be effective. That is when they are most vulnerable. We will let them come close, then strike from multiple directions simultaneously. If we can destroy even 2 or 3 of their flamethrower tanks, the others will withdraw, and we will have held our position." It was a sound plan, based on accurate intelligence and realistic assessment of capabilities. But Brandt had not fully appreciated how much the American tactics had evolved, nor the psychological impact that the flamethrower tanks would have on his men when the moment of truth arrived. The cascade becomes a flood. The American assault on Schwarzwald began at 5:30 hours on January 30th with a devastating artillery barrage. For 45 minutes, 105mm and 150mm shells rained down on the bunker complex and surrounding area. The bunkers themselves, built to withstand such bombardment, survived intact, but the barrage achieved its purpose, suppressing the German defenders, destroying communications lines, and creating a smoke and dust cloud that obscured the battlefield. As the artillery lifted, tank destroyers and conventional Sherman tanks advanced, engaging any German position that revealed itself. Brandt's anti-tank guns, following doctrine, held their fire, waiting for the more valuable flamethrower tanks. But the American tank destroyers were hunting for those anti-tank guns, using their superior optics and the elevated positions they had occupied during the artillery barrage to spot German positions. One of Brandt's Paquet 40 guns fired prematurely, unable to resist the target presented by a Sherman tank at 400 meters. The gun scored a hit, disabling the Sherman, but immediately drew counterfire from 3 tank destroyers. Within 90 seconds, the German gun position was obliterated by high-explosive rounds. Combat engineers advanced under smoke cover, their mine detectors sweeping the ground. German machine guns opened up, killing 2 engineers, but American infantry suppressed the machine gun nests with rifle grenades and mortar fire. The engineers continued their methodical work, marking safe corridors through the minefield with white tape. Inside Bunker 4, Feldwebel Otto Reinhardt watched the American advance through his periscope with growing dread. He had been at Hürtgen Forest, had seen what the flamethrower tanks could do. He knew what was coming. "They're clearing the mines," he reported to Brandt over the field telephone. "The flame tanks will come soon." "Hold your position," Brandt ordered. "The Panzerfaust teams are ready. We will stop them." But Reinhardt could hear the fear in his own voice, and he knew his men heard it too. The bunker, which had felt like a fortress an hour ago, now felt like a tomb waiting to be sealed. The Dragon's assault. At 0715 hours, Captain James Morrison gave the order. All Dragon units commence Phase 3, advance to assault positions. 12 M4A3R3 flamethrower tanks surged forward through the cleared corridors, their improvised, spaced armor giving them a patchwork, almost medieval appearance. They moved fast, engines roaring, tracks churning through the mud and snow. Supporting infantry advanced alongside them, ready to suppress any German anti-tank teams. Brandt's Panzerfaust teams emerged from their concealed positions, brave men carrying weapons that required them to get within 60 meters of enemy tanks to be effective. But the American infantry spotted them immediately. Rifle fire and machine gun bursts cut down 2 teams before they could fire. A third team managed to launch a Panzerfaust at Dragon 7. The rocket struck the tank's spaced armor and detonated, blowing away the outer plate, but leaving the tank operational. The German soldier who had fired it was killed by return fire before he could reload. The flamethrower tanks reached their firing positions, spreading out to engage multiple bunkers simultaneously. Morrison's Dragon 1 targeted Bunker 4, where Feldwebel Reinhardt and his men waited in mounting terror. "Range 40 meters, reported Morrison's flamethrower operator, Corporal Danny Chen. "Target acquired." "Fire," Morrison ordered. The jet of flame shot across the distance with terrible beauty, a stream of liquid fire, brilliant orange and yellow against the grey winter morning. It struck Bunker 4's firing port with perfect accuracy and poured inside. Reinhardt had perhaps 3 seconds to comprehend what was happening. He saw the flame coming, saw it fill the narrow opening, saw it spread across the bunker's interior like a living thing. Then the heat hit him, a wall of searing agony that burned away his scream before it could fully form. The other 7 men in the bunker died with him, their bodies charred beyond recognition within seconds. Dragon 2 engaged Bunker 7. Dragon 3 hit Bunker 9. Dragon 5 poured flame into Bunker 11. One by one, the fortifications that had been built to protect Germany were transformed into crematoriums. The screaming, when it came, was brief. The men inside died too quickly for prolonged agony, though not quickly enough to avoid knowing what was happening to them. The collapse of Will Hauptmann Brandt, commanding from Bunker 1, watched his defensive plan disintegrate in real time. 4 of his bunkers were already destroyed, their garrisons dead. His anti-tank guns had been suppressed or destroyed. His Panzerfaust teams had been cut down before they could engage effectively. And the American flamethrower tanks were still advancing, methodically working their way through his defensive complex. He grabbed the field telephone to order a counterattack, but the line was dead, cut by artillery or simply destroyed by the chaos of battle. He tried the radio but got only static. He was isolated, cut off from most of his command, and the Americans were burning his men alive in their bunkers. In Bunker 6, Gefreiter Hans Müller, the same soldier who had written to his wife about the dragons weeks earlier, made a decision that would have been unthinkable a year ago. He saw the flamethrower tank approaching his position, saw the turret traversing toward his bunker, and knew with absolute certainty that he was about to die in flames. "I'm not burning," he said aloud, though no one was listening. He grabbed a white undershirt from his pack, tied it to his rifle, and pushed it through the firing port, waving it frantically. "Cease fire! They're surrendering!" someone shouted in English outside. The flamethrower tank halted, its weapon trained on the bunker but not firing. American infantry approached cautiously. Müller and the 6 other men in his bunker emerged with their hands raised, faces pale, eyes wide with the terror of men who had just escaped death by seconds. It was the first surrender of the battle, but not the last. In Bunker 8, the entire garrison abandoned their position and fled toward the rear, preferring to risk being shot as deserters rather than face the flames. In Bunker 12, the men refused their officer's orders to remain at their posts, physically restraining him when he tried to force them back to their positions. The psychological collapse spread like a contagion. These were not cowards. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had faced Soviet artillery barrages and human wave attacks. But there was something uniquely terrifying about the flamethrower tanks, something that broke even hardened soldiers. It was the knowledge that if the flame reached you, there was no surviving it, no possibility of a wound that could be treated, no chance of being taken prisoner. There was only burning. The final reckoning. By 0900 hours, bunker complex Schwarzwald had fallen. Of the 14 bunkers, 9 had been destroyed by flamethrowers, their garrisons killed. 3 had been abandoned by their crews, who either surrendered or fled. Only 2 bunkers, including Brandt's command post, remained in German hands, and they were isolated and surrounded. Brandt, facing the inevitable, ordered his remaining men to destroy their weapons and surrender. He emerged from his bunker with his hands raised, his face a mask of exhaustion and defeat. An American lieutenant accepted his surrender and asked, through an interpreter, if he had wounded men who needed medical attention. "The wounded are the lucky ones," Brandt replied bitterly. "The dead, you should see what you did to them, what your fire did. They're not even recognizable as human anymore." The American lieutenant, a young man from Ohio named Robert Patterson, felt a wave of nausea, but kept his expression neutral. "War is hell, Captain. You built these bunkers to kill my men. We found a way to kill yours first. That's all there is to it." Brandt nodded slowly. "Yes, that is all there is to it. But you have unleashed something terrible. Your flamethrower tanks. They don't just kill. They destroy the will to fight. My men were brave, Lieutenant. They had survived years of war. But when they saw those tanks coming, when they heard the screaming from the other bunkers, they broke. Not because they were cowards, but because no man can face that and remain sane." Patterson had no response. He simply gestured for the German captain to join, the other prisoners being assembled in a nearby field. The ripple effect. The fall of Schwarzwald sent shockwaves through the German defensive network. Within hours, reports of the battle had spread to every unit defending the Siegfried Line. The details, some accurate, some exaggerated, painted a picture of unstoppable American fire-breathing tanks that could destroy any bunker, that could not be stopped by conventional anti-tank weapons, that turned fortifications into death traps. The psychological impact was devastating. In sectors where flamethrower tanks had not yet appeared, German soldiers began abandoning bunker positions preemptively, preferring to establish defensive lines in open terrain where they could at least retreat if the fire tanks appeared. Officers reported increasing difficulty in maintaining discipline, with soldiers openly questioning the value of holding fortified positions that offered no protection against the American weapon. A German intelligence report dated February 2, 1945, captured the crisis. The American flamethrower tanks have achieved a psychological impact far exceeding their tactical effect. While the actual number of bunkers destroyed by these weapons remains relatively limited, the fear they inspire has compromised defensive operations across the entire West Wall sector. Soldiers who would previously fight to the last man in fortified positions are now abandoning those positions at the first sign of American armor, unable to distinguish between conventional tanks and flamethrower variants. The defensive value of our fortifications has been effectively negated. Recommend immediate strategic withdrawal to positions where static defense is not required. But there would be no strategic withdrawal. Hitler had forbidden any retreat from the West Wall, declaring that every bunker must be held to the last man. The result was predictable. Units that remained in their bunkers were destroyed by flamethrower attacks, while units that abandoned their positions were destroyed by American artillery and armor in the open. The Siegfried Line, Germany's last great defensive barrier, was crumbling not just under American firepower, but under the weight of its own soldiers' terror. In a prisoner interrogation on February 5th, a captured German lieutenant from the 559th Volksgrenadier Division was asked why his unit had abandoned a seemingly strong defensive position without significant resistance. His answer was recorded in the interrogation report. "We heard what happened at Schwarzwald. We heard about the fire tanks. When we saw American armor approaching, we didn't wait to see if they were the fire tanks or regular tanks. We couldn't stay in those bunkers. Better to die fighting in the open than to burn alive in a concrete box. You Americans don't understand. Your weapon doesn't just kill. It makes men prefer any other death. That's not war anymore. That's something else," the interrogator noted in his report. Subject displayed signs of severe psychological trauma when discussing flamethrower tanks. Recommend dissemination of this intelligence to all units. The psychological impact of our flamethrower tanks may be as valuable as their tactical impact. The Dragon had achieved something that conventional weapons could not. It had broken not just German defenses, but German will. The bunkers of the Siegfried Line, built to be Germany's salvation, had become symbols of helpless terror. And as February 1945 began, the American advance into Germany proper accelerated, with flamethrower tanks leading the way, breathing fire and spreading fear before them. The final flames. By March 1945, the war in Europe had entered its terminal phase. The Siegfried Line had been breached, the Rhine crossed, and American forces were driving deep into the heart of Germany. The Wehrmacht, once the most formidable military machine in the world, was disintegrating, not in a single catastrophic collapse, but in 1,000 small surrenders, retreats, and desertions. The M4A3R3 flamethrower tanks, now numbering over 400 in the European theatre, had become an integral component of American combined arms doctrine, their reputation preceding them like a herald of doom. The final major engagement involving flamethrower tanks in Europe occurred on April 16, 1945, during the assault on the city of Nuremberg, the symbolic heart of Nazi pageantry and propaganda. The city's medieval fortifications had been supplemented with modern bunkers and defensive positions, creating a defensive network that the German commander, General der Infanterie Karl von Le Sueur, believed could hold for weeks, buying time for what? No one knew anymore. The war was lost, but the fighting continued. Captain James Morrison, now a major and commanding a full battalion of flamethrower tanks, led the assault on Nuremberg's southern defences. His unit had fought continuously since the Hürtgen Forest, had burned out hundreds of bunkers, had seen dozens of crew members killed or wounded. Morrison himself had changed. The young lieutenant, who had felt sick at the sound of men burning, was now a hardened combat veteran who viewed the flamethrower as simply another tool, no more morally complicated than a rifle or an artillery shell. The assault on Nuremberg followed the now standard Cascade Protocol: artillery preparation, conventional armor suppression, engineer breaching, infantry advance, and finally, the flamethrower tanks moving forward to neutralize the fortified positions. But something was different this time. The German resistance, while still deadly, lacked the fanatical determination of earlier battles. Bunkers that would have fought to the last man in January were surrendering after token resistance in April. The psychological collapse that had begun at Schwarzwald had become complete. Morrison's battalion destroyed 43 bunkers in the Nuremberg operation, but they accepted the surrender of 67 more, bunkers whose garrisons emerged with white flags the moment they saw the distinctive silhouette of the flamethrower tanks approaching. The weapon had achieved its ultimate effectiveness. It no longer needed to fire to accomplish its mission. The threat alone was sufficient. On April 20th, Hitler's birthday, though few Germans were celebrating, Morrison received orders to cease offensive operations. The war was effectively over. 5 days later, American and Soviet forces linked up at the Elbe River. On May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Dragon had run out of targets. The reckoning of numbers. In the months following Germany's surrender, military analysts began the painstaking work of assessing the flamethrower tank's impact on the war. The statistics were striking, though they told only part of the story. From December 1944 through May 1945, M4A3R3 flamethrower tanks had been directly responsible for the destruction or capture of approximately 2,147 German fortified positions across the Western Front. They had participated in 312 major engagements and countless smaller actions. The cost had been significant. 89 flamethrower tanks destroyed, with 267 crew members killed and 412 wounded. The loss rate was higher than for conventional Sherman tanks, reflecting the dangerous close-range nature of flamethrower operations. But the raw numbers obscured the weapon's true impact. Colonel David Henderson, tasked with preparing the official Army assessment of flamethrower tank operations, wrote in his report dated August 1945, "The M4A3R3's tactical value cannot be measured solely in bunkers destroyed or enemy casualties inflicted. Its primary contribution was psychological. The weapon created a crisis in German defensive doctrine and morale that accelerated the collapse of organized resistance. Intelligence estimates suggest that for every bunker actually destroyed by flamethrowers, 3 to 5 additional bunkers were abandoned or surrendered due to fear of the weapon. This force multiplication effect may have shortened the war in Europe by several weeks and saved thousands of Allied lives." The German perspective confirmed this assessment. In post-war interrogations, senior German officers consistently cited the flamethrower tanks as one of the most demoralizing weapons they had faced. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the German Armed Forces High Command, stated during his war crimes trial, "The American flamethrower tanks represented a tactical innovation that we had no effective counter for. More significantly, they destroyed the psychological foundation of our defensive strategy. Soldiers could not be compelled to remain in fortified positions when they knew those positions offered no protection against fire. The weapon undermined military discipline and accelerated the disintegration of our forces in the final months of the war. The human cost behind the statistics were human stories of men who had wielded the weapon and men who had faced it. For the American crews, the psychological burden of operating flamethrower tanks proved to be one of the war's hidden casualties. Corporal Danny Chen, who had operated the flamethrower on Zippo II since the Hürtgen Forest, returned home to San Francisco in August 1945. His family found him changed, withdrawn, prone to nightmares, unable to discuss his wartime experiences. In a letter to his former commander, written in 1947, Chen attempted to articulate what he had experienced. "I killed a lot of men in the war, Captain. I don't know how many, hundreds probably. I never saw most of them, just fired into bunkers and moved on to the next target. But I heard them. Every single time I heard them screaming. It only lasted a few seconds, but those seconds are burned into my memory more permanently than any scar. I did what I had to do. I saved American lives. I'd do it again if I had to. But I can't pretend it didn't cost me something. Part of me died in those bunkers along with the Germans." Chen's experience was not unique. Post-war psychological studies of flamethrower tank crews revealed significantly higher rates of what would later be termed post-traumatic stress disorder compared to crews of conventional tanks. The intimate nature of the killing, the sounds, the smells, the knowledge of exactly how the enemy was dying, created psychological wounds that many veterans carried for the rest of their lives. For the German soldiers who survived encounters with flamethrower tanks, the trauma was even more profound. Hans Müller, the soldier who had surrendered at Schwarzwald rather than face the flames, spent the rest of his life haunted by the memory of that day. In the memoir published in 1963, he wrote, "I survived the war, but part of me died in that bunker when I saw the flame coming toward us. I dream about it still. The orange light filling the firing port, the heat, the screaming from the other bunkers. I surrendered because I could not face burning alive. Some call that cowardice. Perhaps it was. But I have spoken with other veterans, men who fought at Stalingrad and Normandy, and none of them judge me. They understand that there are some deaths that are worse than others, and burning is the worst. The Americans brought hell to the battlefield, and no man can be expected to stand firm in the face of hell itself." The technological legacy. The M4A3R3 flamethrower tank's combat success ensured its place in military history, but its technological legacy proved more complex. In the immediate post-war period, the U.S. military continued to develop and deploy flamethrower tanks, using them extensively in the Korean War and, to a lesser extent, in Vietnam. The basic concept, mounting a flamethrower on an armored chassis to neutralize fortified positions, remained tactically sound. But the weapon's psychological impact and the ethical questions it raised led to increasing discomfort within the military establishment. The 1980 United Nations Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons included Protocol 3, which restricted the use of incendiary weapons against civilian populations and in civilian areas. While military use of flamethrowers remained technically legal under international law, their deployment became increasingly rare. By the 1990s, flamethrower tanks had been phased out of U.S. military service entirely, replaced by thermobaric weapons and precision-guided munitions that could neutralize fortified positions without the visceral horror of burning defenders alive. The Dragon had been retired, not because it was ineffective, but because modern warfare had found ways to kill that were more palatable to both operators and observers. Master Sergeant Vincent Calabrese, the maintenance NCO, whose improvised armor modifications had saved countless lives, remained in the army after the war and eventually retired as a command sergeant major in 1965. In an oral history interview conducted in 1978, he reflected on his wartime innovations. "I'm proud of what we accomplished. The spaced armor worked, the tactics worked, and we saved American lives. That was the job. But I'll tell you something. I'm also glad that weapon isn't used anymore. It was necessary in 1945, but war should be about defeating the enemy, not terrorizing them. The flamethrower tanks did both, and maybe that's why they made everyone uncomfortable, even the people who used them. Some weapons are too effective, if that makes sense. They win battles, but they also brutalize everyone involved, the people using them and the people facing them." The forgotten heroes. In the decades following World War II, the flamethrower tank crews received little public recognition for their contributions. Unlike fighter pilots or infantry heroes, their story was not one that fit comfortably into patriotic narratives. The weapon they had wielded was too controversial, the deaths they had inflicted too disturbing. Veterans organizations held reunions, but they were small, quiet affairs, attended by men who understood what they had done and why, but who had no desire to celebrate it publicly. Captain, later Colonel, James Morrison retired from the Army in 1965 and became a high school history teacher in Pennsylvania. He rarely spoke about his wartime service, and when he did, He focused on the tactical and strategic aspects, avoiding discussion of the human cost. But in 1989, when a former student asked him directly about the flamethrower tanks, Morrison provided an answer that captured the moral complexity of his wartime experience. "We did terrible things in that war. We burned men alive in bunkers they couldn't escape from. We heard them screaming, and we kept firing because that was our job. Was it necessary? Yes. The Germans had built fortifications that conventional weapons couldn't defeat without massive casualties. The flamethrower tanks solved that problem and saved American lives. Was it right? I don't know. I've spent 40 years thinking about that question, and I still don't have a good answer. What I do know is that war forces men to make impossible choices, and we made the choices we thought were necessary at the time. History can judge whether we were right. We just had to live with what we did." The final assessment. The M4A3R3 flamethrower tank represented a convergence of technological innovation, tactical adaptation, and psychological warfare that fundamentally altered the final months of World War II in Europe. It was not a war-winning weapon in the sense that the atomic bomb or radar were war-winning technologies, but it was a problem-solving weapon that addressed a specific tactical challenge: how to neutralize fortified positions without suffering prohibitive casualties, and did so with devastating effectiveness. The weapon's true impact lay not in the bunkers it destroyed, but in the defensive doctrine it rendered obsolete. For centuries, fortifications had been a cornerstone of military strategy, offering defenders a force-multiplying advantage that could offset numerical inferiority. The flamethrower tank demonstrated that even the strongest fortification could be neutralized quickly and efficiently, transforming defensive strongpoints from assets into liabilities. The psychological dimension of this transformation cannot be overstated. The flamethrower tank didn't just destroy bunkers, it destroyed the confidence of soldiers ordered to defend them. It created a crisis of morale that accelerated the collapse of German resistance and shortened the war. In doing so, it saved lives, both Allied soldiers who would have died assaulting fortified positions and German soldiers who surrendered rather than face the flames. But this effectiveness came at a cost, a moral and psychological cost that affected everyone involved. The crews who operated the weapons carried psychological scars that lasted lifetimes. The enemy soldiers who faced them experienced a terror that transcended normal combat fear. And the weapon itself became a symbol of warfare's capacity for calculated brutality, a reminder that military necessity can justify methods that would be unconscionable in any other context. In the end, the M4A3R3 flamethrower tank was exactly what its creators intended, a specialized tool designed to solve a specific problem. It succeeded brilliantly at its mission. But its success raised questions about the nature of warfare, the limits of acceptable violence, and the psychological cost of wielding weapons designed not just to kill, but to terrorize. These questions remain relevant today, as military technology continues to develop new ways to defeat enemies while minimizing friendly casualties. The Dragon breathed fire for only 6 months, but its flames cast shadows that stretched across decades. The men who built it, operated it, and faced it are mostly gone now, but their story remains, a testament to human ingenuity, courage, and the terrible choices that war demands. The bunkers they fought over have long since crumbled, but the lessons learned in those desperate battles continue to shape military doctrine and ethical debates about the conduct of war. German troops had felt safe in their bunkers, protected by concrete and steel, until they realized that American Sherman tanks could breathe fire. And in that realization, in that moment of terror when safety became a death trap, the outcome of the war's final chapter was written not in strategy or logistics, but in flames. The story of the M4A3R3 flamethrower tanks is just one chapter in the vast, complex narrative of World War II, a war that reshaped the world and continues to influence our present. If you found this story compelling, there are countless other untold stories from that conflict waiting to be discovered. Stories of innovation and adaptation, of courage and sacrifice, of the terrible choices that war demands, and the human cost of victory. Subscribe to this channel to explore more hidden histories of World War II, the weapons, tactics, and human experiences that changed the course of the war, but have been forgotten or overlooked by mainstream narratives. Each video brings you deep into the reality of the conflict, beyond the simplified versions found in textbooks. What other aspects of World War II would you like to see explored? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. Was it the role of logistics in the Allied victory? The psychological warfare tactics used by both sides? The technological innovations that emerged from the conflict? Your input helps shape future content. Hit the like button if this story gave you a new perspective on the war, and share it with anyone interested in military history, World War II, or the human dimension of technological warfare. Remember, history is not just about the big battles and famous generals. It's about the innovations made under pressure, the adaptations that saved lives, and the human beings who faced impossible situations and found ways to survive. The flamethrower tank crews were ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances, and their story deserves to be remembered. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.